Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Grace Holland. If you've ever driven across the Neuse River on US 64, you may have wondered about a mysterious stone ruin crumbling along the side of the road. Today, Hidden History reporter Heather Leah and I talk about our exploration of that roadside ruin that dates back to the Great Depression and is tied to the origins of US 64 itself. Heather, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So this was quite an adventure that we had. Can you tell us a little bit about this ruin and how you found out about it?
Yeah, so I know a lot about ruins across Raleigh and North Carolina, and it's pretty hard to find one that I don't know anything about. But people surprised me, and someone had posted in a Raleigh group on Facebook this picture of this stone chimney, essentially, on the side of the road, and wondering what it was. And so a few people tagged me, thinking I would know, and I had no idea. I didn't even know it was there.
Stumped you.
It stumped me. I was like, wow, I don't know. But now I'm curious, and I can find out. So I actually just took the picture to start with, and my first bit of research was to just put it on my wall and see if anybody I knew. Because a lot of the history that's hidden is really just people's oral history and what they remember about Raleigh. And so I try to find people who maybe remember this ruin. And a few people told me they were pretty sure that it was the remnants of a restaurant that used to stand on US 64, this kind of riverside restaurant that fed the people that worked on the river. I know that Milburn Dam is near there. So, that's what a lot of people were saying they remembered. But other people were saying they think it was older and that maybe it was a homestead. Some people thought that it was a restaurant that had burned down. So I was getting a few different answers. And then someone tagged a historian who pretty much knew everything about it.
Oakley Dean Baldwin, author, folklorist, local historian.
He brought us out there to take a look at it, and you came with me, and it was pretty interesting to take a look at it because it is just right on the side of the road.
All right, so I guess watch this water puddle here.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of people apparently have been wondering about this ruin. I just don't happen to go down this stretch of 64. But it's very visible from the roadside, and it's really cool looking. It's like a towering stone fireplace. It's got a couple of pillars beside it. One of the pillars has been knocked over by a tree.
This column was sitting right there.
And it had these little stone walls beside it. It's very visible and interesting to look at. And it was exciting to go see it for myself, something new.
Yeah.
And what did you think about it? When you walked up on it, what was your first impression?
Yeah, and of course this was the first time I've gone on one of these adventures with you. I really love history, and Heather's been kind enough to let me join her, and I'm working on this story for TV. And so when we got out there, I think I was just kind of curious how noticeable it was. If it was kind of one of those things, if you're driving through all the time you're going to see it, or if it's like it catches your eye when you first drive through it. I think it probably depends on the season. Of course, right now it's winter, so it is a lot easier to see it because the trees are not grown up. But yeah, I just remember when we got close to it, got within eyesight of it, we kind of both said to each other, oh my gosh, it's right there.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah. It's very obvious right there before the bridge. It's obvious why people are wondering about this ruin.
Yeah, and once we got talking to Mr. Baldwin and we were walking up to it, I was just struck by how close it is to the traffic lanes. It's it was definitely, we had to be very careful, and of course we were.
I don't think we have to worry about any snakes or anything right now, but our footing is the big thing. We're going to stay farther enough to the left to stay out of the traffic lane.
Just being mindful of the road because it is right there.
I was worried about you with the big camera.
Yes.
You should have seen her. You can't see it on TV, right? But she's kneeling like right there with the traffic on 64 speeding by right behind her, and she's getting these great shots of this ruin, and I'm just like watching like, oh my gosh, this is really close to the traffic.
Yeah, don't try this at home, folks.
No.
Definitely one of those. But yeah, it was just, I think I was also surprised just by how intact it still was.
Yeah.
Like you could still very much tell it was a chimney. It certainly wasn't usable at this point. But then, Oakley was telling us that he used to find charcoals and stuff in it when he first found it in the 80s.
Well, picture all these trees gone and a little spot over here where people could pull off the road and actually cook a meal in this even up until the late 1980s.
Yeah. Apparently, people had still been using it. So, turns out it was built in the 30s as part of the New Deal. So, back in the Great Depression, when people were really hurting for jobs and money, that this was where they would feed. They'd make the food to feed like 200 to 300 people that were working and building US 64. And so it turns out that's what the ruin is. But the people who thought it was a restaurant are not entirely wrong, and we will get into that. But it's very intact. There's the chimney, and you can walk right up and look in the chimney, look in the fireplace, look in the stove. And then there's this stone slab beside the stove. And I asked, like, what was that for? And he said it was like the counter. He imagines. Obviously, he wasn't there. But it looks like it was the counter, and that they would maybe take a big hog or something and, like, cut it up right there on that counter. I imagine they prepared food there. And then he said they would deliver the food up and down the line of US 64. So there's quite a lot remaining. Yeah, the pillars are still standing. Apparently, looked at pictures of it. Used to have a roof. And I mean, with the rooftop on it, it looked almost like a little building. So I could see why people thought maybe this was a restaurant, but it wasn't.
Yeah, we'll get into a restaurant tie that it has. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back. So Heather, tell us a little bit. You kind of walked through that this chimney was built to feed people who were working on the road initially. How long was it used for that?
Yeah, so it would have been built in the early 1930s. And again, the workers here did not make much money. It was the Great Depression. They'd send a lot of it home.
Those men were paid $1 an hour to work on our roads up until about 1942.
And they were eating from this location. Well, in the 40s, it was closed down because the New Deal was over. There was no more CCC. But this was an integral part of US 64 being built in this part of Wake County. So anyway, closes down, but it's still pretty functional. Again, the pictures we saw from, I believe, the 60s still had the rooftop on it and everything. So the restaurant, right? There was indeed a restaurant. It's called King's Riverside Restaurant. And so some people might remember that because that didn't close until the 60s.
They actually had a roof over this at one time when King's Riverside Restaurant was using it. They had a roof built over it.
Apparently, the employees at the restaurant would cross the two lanes of US 64, because there were only two lanes at the time.
And the employees would physically have to walk across a two-lane highway to come over here to cook.
In this stove area, in this little roadside kitchen.
And then bring the food back over to the restaurant.
So this was indeed a riverside restaurant. Oakley told us that people could rent like rafts and things to go on the Neuse River there. So if you're remembering the restaurant, that is the connection. But it was actually across 64 from the restaurant. And from what we're hearing, it sounds like the restaurant would have stood where the median of US 64 is today. So that's the 60s. So this ruin starts in the 30s, has this one use, and then continues and begins being used by this restaurant. Well, the restaurant closes in the 60s, and then we heard, I think you were maybe mentioning this earlier, people continued to use it into maybe even the 80s and maybe even the 90s.
Yeah, so Oakley was telling us he first found this because he was a Wake County deputy, and he used to patrol in this area along New Bern Avenue, and so he got to where he would stop there a lot.
It used to stick out all by itself sitting here, so I always wondered what it was.
And he was curious about this because he was like, what is this? He walks up to it, and he finds charcoals in it.
And then once I got retired, I did the research and found out what this was about.
And so he realized that all these decades after it had been used, even for the restaurant, people were just using it as they were traveling through to cook a little picnic lunch or something. So that's really fascinating, just the different roles over time that this stove has been used for. Do we know whether there are any other ruins like this up and down US 64, especially considering this was used for the CCC initially? I mean, assumably that was a long area that they were working on the road.
Yeah, I was really curious about that too. Taken in by the mystery, as it were. Oakley's thought, and my thought as well, truthfully, is that, yep, it's a long stretch of road. From what Oakley has told us, there are other stoves like this. It's a stove, kind of like a stone kitchen, right? But there's other places just like this that look identical around the country that were all part of the CCC, and they're very identical, right?
A year and a half ago, when I was really doing a lot of background research on this stove, I found several on the internet from other states, and they looked exactly identical to this one. So that told me right off the bat that I was on the right trail. And then I found several documents stating that this stove was built by the CCC folks.
So given that this was a commonly used structure that they replicated around the country and that US 64 is long, I personally wouldn't be surprised if there were more of these down 64 down the line, because you're not going to want to have to carry the food too far down 64. So I would not be shocked if there were others. Now, are they hidden in the woods? You know, this one's right by the roadside. The other ones could be developed over. You know, they may have been destroyed and neighborhoods could be built on top of them or other developments. They could be in the woods, overgrown, or they could be in less good condition and just might look like a pile of rocks. But it is possible that there at least were others and maybe some remnant sightings somewhere. If someone knows, let us know. I'd like to go see the other ones too, you know?
Yeah, which got us curious about what will happen to this, because it's right there by the road, obviously. But one thing that also struck us when we were walking up is that right behind there, there's a big development. You can see a lot of land's been cleared and stuff. And we weren't sure what that was. We also didn't know who technically owned this. We thought maybe NCDOT, just because of where it is on the right-of-way. Sure. So I reached out to NCDOT, and a spokesperson told me that looking at their documents, they'd have to survey to be sure, but it appears that it would be technically right out of their right-of-way. And they also sent me some documents related to the development project that's going on behind it, which is, I think it's a mixed-use neighborhood called Edgewater Commons that they're working on. And that would be, there's some documentation that was done by the city of Raleigh related to that. So I've reached out to the city. But in the meantime, I was reading through some documents and found some survey maps and stuff, and I only found one mention of the chimney, and all it says is chimney, and then in parentheses it says to be removed. Oh. So we don't, you know, we're working to figure out more about what that means there. And, you know, removed doesn't necessarily mean destroyed. It's possible that folks, you know, at the city or developers don't know the history.
Sure.
And that's why Oakley wanted to talk to us, right?
Yeah. You know, a lot of times, you know, I've done quite a lot of work with historians and historic preservation, and especially with this type of history where a lot of people don't know what it is, don't remember it. It's from the 30s. There aren't many people around who would remember that structure. And it's starting to fall apart. That people just don't even realize that it has significance. So it's possible, you know, that if people realize that it's significant, maybe, I know Oakley is hoping for this, that there'll be some sort of movement to maybe just move it, preserve it in some way.
And then put a placard out in front of it saying, hey, this is the stove that we use to feed these men to actually build Highway 64 all the way to, you know, what used to be Tarboro Road. Lord only knows how many miles down the road it went, you know.
But at the very least, to document it and make sure that it's not just completely forgotten.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Heather, for joining us to explore this history that's hidden in plain sight. And thank you for listening to the WRAL Daily Download. You can find more podcasts from WRAL News at WRAL.com. Search podcasts. From sports to true crime, there are plenty of shows to keep you informed and entertained. Thanks for listening.